The shovel hit wood with a hollow thud. Solomon's hands were shaking. They'd been digging for 2 hours in the darkness of Riverside Cemetery, working as quietly as possible, every sound feeling loud enough to wake the entire county. But this was the third night, the exact window Solomon had promised. Any sooner and Elijah would wake in the coffin. Any later and the drug would become permanent. 3 days. That was all they had. "Clear the top," Solomon whispered to the 4 men helping him. Marcus, Isaiah, Joshua, and Caleb. All men who'd lost something to plantation cruelty. All men willing to risk execution for grave robbing. Because some things were worth dying for. They cleared dirt from the coffin lid, pried it open with crowbars. Lantern light spilled into the grave, illuminating Elijah's face. Gray, sunken, dead. Marcus touched his neck, feeling for a pulse. Long seconds passed. "We're too late," he whispered. "He's gone." But Solomon pushed his hand aside, felt more carefully, searching. Then he found it, so faint it was barely there. 1 heartbeat every 2 minutes. "He's alive," Solomon breathed. "Barely. Help me get him out." They lifted Elijah's body from the coffin. Dead weight, no muscle tone, no response. His skin was cold as marble. Therefore, Solomon knew they had maybe minutes, maybe less. He'd brought 3 vials, 3 antidotes prepared from roots and herbs whose names he wouldn't speak aloud. The first would stimulate the heart. The second would restart breathing. The third would wake consciousness. He poured them into Elijah's mouth one by one, massaged his throat to make him swallow, waited. Nothing happened. 5 minutes passed. 10. "Maybe the drug was too strong," Isaiah said quietly. "Maybe we lost him." But then Elijah gasped, a huge, desperate, rattling intake of breath that sounded like someone drowning finally reaching air. His eyes flew open, unseeing, panicked. His body convulsed violently as the system fought its way back to life. So the men held him down while he shook, while his heart raced, while his lungs heaved, while he vomited black bile and gagged and trembled like he was freezing despite the warm Mississippi night. After 10 terrible minutes, Elijah could finally focus his eyes, could see the faces around him, could recognize Solomon kneeling beside him. Did it work? His voice was barely a rasp. Solomon smiled. "You're alive. That's what matters." But Elijah's next words weren't relief or gratitude. They were rage. "Blackwood?" he managed, his voice getting stronger. "Where's Blackwood?" "The plantation," Marcus told him. "He thinks you're dead and buried. Whole county thinks so. You're free now. We can get you north to Union lines." "No." Elijah tried to sit up, failed. His body wasn't ready. 3 days without movement, without food, without blood circulating properly. He was extraordinarily weak, because surviving near death was only the first step. "Not yet," Elijah said. And something in his voice made the other men go quiet. "Blackwood has to pay, for the soldiers, for the witnesses, for everything." So they understood then. This wasn't about escape. This was about revenge. "You're too weak," Solomon said carefully. "You can barely move. And even when you recover, what can you do? Blackwood has guards, guns, power." "I died," Elijah interrupted and smiled. It was a terrible smile. "I was buried. I came back. You think Blackwood's guards scare me after that?" He gripped Solomon's arm with surprising strength. "Help me get ready. Help me get strong. Then I'll do what needs doing." Therefore the men looked at each other, weighing the risks, weighing the cost. But one by one, they nodded. Because this wasn't just about Elijah anymore. This was about every slave who'd suffered, every family destroyed, every life stolen by men like Blackwood. This was about proving that even the dead could rise to demand justice. To understand how Elijah ended up in that grave, how he learned to die and come back, how one man's vengeance would leave 13 bodies and expose a fortune built on murder, we need to go back. Back to March 1862. Back to Yazoo County, Mississippi. Back to when the Civil War was tearing the nation apart and plantation owners were getting desperate. Back to when Elijah was still just a house slave who thought if he stayed quiet and invisible, he might survive. He was wrong. This is the story of Elijah, a 19-year-old house slave who witnessed something he was never supposed to see. A master murdering 7 Confederate soldiers to steal $2 million in gold. But seeing wasn't Elijah's mistake. Being seen was. Because Harrison Blackwood, the master of Blackwood Manor, couldn't leave witnesses alive. Not to mass murder. not to the theft of Confederate treasury funds, not to crimes that would get him hanged if anyone ever found out. So Blackwood poisoned Elijah, watched him die, had him buried in Riverside Cemetery, case closed, witness eliminated, secret protected. Except Elijah didn't die. Not really. Because an old slave named Solomon knew secrets, African secrets about plants that could slow your heart until doctors couldn't detect it, about drugs that mimicked death so convincingly that even your killer would believe you were gone, about how to die and come back. 3 days in the grave, 3 days of near death, 3 days of darkness and silence and being trapped in your own body. Then resurrection and revenge. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this is the kind of history they don't teach in schools. The kind that shows enslaved people weren't just victims waiting for freedom. They were strategists, fighters, people who found ways to resist even when resistance meant dying first. Subscribe if you want to hear stories about people who refused to stay buried, about justice that came from the grave, about the night one man rose from the dead and 13 others died screaming. This is Elijah's story, and it starts with gold. March 1862. The Mississippi Delta was drowning in two things: cotton and fear. Because the Civil War had been raging for a year, and the Confederacy was losing. Not obviously, not yet. Confederate propaganda still claimed Southern superiority, still promised a quick victory, still insisted one Southern gentleman could whip 10 Yankees. But plantation owners like Harrison Blackwood knew better. He'd fought at First Bull Run, had seen Union artillery, had watched modern warfare turn men into meat, had understood with terrible clarity that the industrial North was going to win. So he'd come home to Yazoo County in late 1861, claiming chronic dysentery, really just terrified. Because if the Confederacy fell, if slavery was abolished, men like Blackwood would lose everything. Not just money, not just property. Their entire world, their identity, the foundation of their existence. That fear made them dangerous, made them willing to do things peacetime would never permit, made them brutal in ways that shocked even a society built on casual violence. Blackwood Manor sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Delta farmland, worth over $400,000 before the war, equivalent to tens of millions today. The main house was Greek Revival perfection. White columns gleaming, magnolia trees surrounding carefully manicured gardens, the kind of place Northern abolitionists wrote about when they wanted to prove Southern civilization was real. But behind that beautiful facade was an empire of suffering. 230 slaves worked the fields, 18-hour days during harvest, heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees, overseers who believed whipping was the only language slaves understood. Because to Blackwood, slaves weren't people. They were investments that needed managing. Roughly 10% of his workforce died every year. Heat exhaustion, infection, accidents, beatings that went too far. So Blackwood simply replaced them, purchased new slaves, forced breeding among existing population. The system ground on. Elijah had been born on Blackwood Manor in 1843, son of a woman named Grace who'd been brought from Virginia as a teenager. His father's identity was unknown, possibly an overseer, possibly Blackwood's own father. Elijah's light skin suggested mixed ancestry. That brought both advantages and dangers in the slave hierarchy. At age 7, he'd been selected as a house slave, trained to serve in the main house, to be invisible and useful simultaneously. Therefore, he had access to information field slaves never obtained. He learned to read by watching Blackwood's children with their tutors, memorizing letters and words, practicing in secret despite severe penalties for slave literacy. By 15, Elijah could read newspapers, could understand political discussions, could comprehend the wider world beyond Yazoo County. That education made him dangerous. Because Elijah understood slavery wasn't natural or inevitable, understood it was a political and economic system maintained by violence and law, understood it could be challenged, resisted, potentially overthrown. So he watched and waited. Waited for the abolitionist movement to grow, waited for sectional tensions to escalate, waited for Mississippi to secede after Lincoln's election, waited for opportunity. That opportunity began materializing in February 1862, though Elijah didn't recognize it immediately. Blackwood received late-night visitors, 3 Confederate officers in dust-covered uniforms. They arrived in a closed carriage, didn't want to be seen, spoke in hushed tones in Blackwood's study. Elijah was serving brandy, maintaining the fiction of invisibility that house slaves perfected. He heard fragments of conversation, words like gold and security and absolute discretion. one officer said. "Richmond trusts you, Colonel. This is the Confederacy's future we're entrusting to your care." Blackwood responded with assurances about loyalty and safety, because something significant was happening, something secret. After the officers left, Blackwood's behavior changed. He became nervous, excited, fearful all at once. So Elijah knew, whatever was coming would be big. The gold arrived on February 28, 1862. Elijah was awakened at 2 a.m. by unusual sounds. Wagons rolling through the plantation in darkness, men shouting in low voices. He crept to a window, looked out, saw something extraordinary. A military convoy, 6 wagons, each drawn by 4 horses. Confederate soldiers surrounding them, at least 30 men, all heavily armed. Supervising it all was a young officer, the captain whose nameplate read, Brennan. The wagons pulled up to Blackwood's largest barn, the one usually used for storing cotton, currently empty because the 1861 harvest had already shipped. Soldiers began unloading crates, heavy wooden crates that required 2 men to carry, crates that made metallic sounds when shifted. 20 crates total, each marked with Confederate Army stamps. The unloading took 2 hours. When finished, the barn was locked with 3 separate padlocks. Guards were posted. Captain Brennan retired to the plantation house as Blackwood's guest. Over the next 3 days, Elijah pieced together what had happened. The crates contained gold, Confederate gold, approximately $2 million worth. Not just any gold, because this was part of the Confederate Treasury's emergency reserve. The fund meant to keep the rebellion alive if everything else failed. Gold that could buy supplies, pay soldiers, purchase recognition from European powers. It had been moved from Richmond as Union forces threatened the Confederate capital. So now it was being dispersed to multiple hiding places throughout the Deep South. Places where, even if Richmond fell, even if the Confederate government collapsed, this gold could fund guerrilla resistance, could finance continuation of the war by other means. Blackwood Manor had been chosen because of its isolation, its tightly controlled slave population. Blackwood's reputation as a hardline Confederate. Captain Wesley Brennan commanded the 6-soldier escort assigned to guard the gold. They were to remain at the plantation until receiving further orders from Richmond. Could be weeks, could be months, depended on how the war progressed. They settled into routine, slept in the barn with the gold, took meals at the main house, patrolled the grounds. Young men, most barely 20. Excited to have such an important mission, also bored by guard duty tedium. Elijah watched all of this with growing realization. $2 million hidden on the plantation, guarded by only 6 soldiers. If that gold could be seized, if it could be taken from Confederate control, it could change everything. Could fund slave escapes, could buy freedom for hundreds of families, could support the Union war effort. But how could one slave, or even all 230 slaves on the plantation, overcome armed guards? How could they move 20 crates of gold without being caught? How could they convert Confederate gold into practical freedom? These questions became irrelevant on March 3, 1862. Because that was the night Harrison Blackwood decided $2 million in gold sitting on his property was too tempting to resist. That was the night he chose personal wealth over Confederate loyalty. That was the night he became a murderer on a scale that shocked even Elijah. And Elijah thought he'd seen every form of cruelty slavery could produce. He was wrong. Before everything went dark, there were people who made Elijah's life bearable. His mother, Grace, worked in the laundry, 41 years old, had been enslaved her entire life, had watched her 3 children grow up in bondage with no power to protect them. But she tried anyway. She taught Elijah to be careful, to watch, to listen, to remember everything because knowledge was the only inheritance slaves could pass down. "You're smart," she told him when he was young. "Smarter than they want you to be. So you gotta hide that. Gotta make them think you're simple. Make them think you're harmless." "Why?" Elijah asked. "Because smart slaves are dangerous slaves, and dangerous slaves get sold away or killed." She was right. Therefore, Elijah learned to perform stupidity, to ask questions he already knew answers to move slowly through tasks he could complete quickly, to make Blackwood think he was useful but limited. It kept him safe. For a while. His sister Ruth was 15, worked in the fields, strong despite her age, could pick 120 pounds of cotton on a good day. She had dreams because she was young enough to still believe dreams mattered. Someday, she'd whisper to Elijah on Sunday afternoons when they got brief rest, "I'm going to be free. Going to walk wherever I want, going to read whatever I want, going to be my own person." How? Elijah would ask, wanting to believe but knowing better. Don't know yet. But slavery can't last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Elijah loved her optimism, even though it hurt to hear, because he knew things Ruth didn't. Had access to newspapers and political discussions. Understood that even if slavery ended someday, it wouldn't be soon. Wouldn't be in time to save them. So he protected her innocence as long as he could. Let her dream while they watched the world with clear, sadder eyes. There was also Solomon, old man who lived on a neighboring plantation called Rosewood, nearly 70 years old, had been born in Africa, had been brought to America on a slave ship in his youth. He retained knowledge of African medicine, spiritual practices, things white masters didn't understand and feared. Solomon taught Elijah about plants, about which roots healed and which killed, about the thin line between medicine and poison, about how everything in nature had purpose if you knew how to see it. Your mama taught you to be careful with words, Solomon said once. I'm teaching you to be careful with plants, because both can save you or destroy you, depending on how you use them. Why teach me this? Elijah asked. Because you're going to need it someday. Don't know when, don't know how. But I see it in you. You're going to face something terrible. And this knowledge might be the only thing that saves you. At the time, Elijah didn't understand. He would later. In the house, Elijah worked alongside other slaves who'd become family through shared survival. Thomas, the butler, 50 years old, had served 3 generations of Blackwoods, knew more about the family than they knew about themselves. Watch everything, Thomas told him. Remember everything. Because someday, someone's going to ask questions. Someone's going to want to know what really happened here, and we're the only ones who'll remember the truth. Martha, the cook, made elaborate meals for the Blackwood family while enslaved people in the quarters ate cornmeal and salt pork. She taught Elijah about poisons because cooking and killing weren't that different. See this? She'd show him a mushroom. In small amounts makes you sick. In large amounts, stops your heart. And it tastes like regular mushrooms. So someone could add it to a dish, and you'd never know until too late. Why tell me this? Because knowledge is power. Even if you never use it, knowing gives you options. These people, Grace, Ruth, Solomon, Thomas, Martha, were Elijah's foundation. They weren't just co-victims in a system of oppression. They were teachers, protectors, family chosen through shared circumstances and mutual survival. So when Blackwood started murdering people to protect his stolen gold, when Elijah became the last witness who needed eliminating, when death came for him that night in March, Elijah had something many slaves didn't have: knowledge. Grace had taught him to watch and remember. Solomon had taught him about plants that mimicked death. Martha had taught him about poisons and their effects. Thomas had taught him that truth matters, that bearing witness matters, that someone needs to survive to tell what really happened. All of those lessons came together in one terrible moment. The moment Elijah realized Blackwood was going to kill him. The moment he understood his only chance of survival was dying first. But before that moment came, there were still a few days of normal life. A few days when Elijah didn't know he was about to witness mass murder. A few days when he thought his intelligence and caution would be enough to keep him safe. A few days when he still believed that if you just worked hard and stayed invisible, maybe you could survive slavery intact. On Sunday, March 2nd, 1862, the day before everything changed, Elijah sat with his mother and sister near the quarters. They shared cornbread Martha had snuck from the kitchen, talked about small things, avoided talking about big things because big things hurt too much. "You be careful," Grace told Elijah as the sun set. "Something feels wrong. Can't explain it. Just a feeling." "I'm always careful, Mama." "I know, but be extra careful. Promise me." He promised. Didn't understand why she was worried. Therefore, when Blackwood invited Captain Brennan and his soldiers to dinner the next night, when Elijah was assigned to serve, when he stood by the door maintaining perfect invisibility, he had no idea he was about to witness something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Had no idea that by the time the dinner ended, 7 men would be dead. Had no idea that within 2 weeks, he'd be next. Had no idea that the only way to survive would be dying first. The dinner started innocently. Blackwood invited Captain Brennan and his 6 soldiers to the main house on March 3rd, 1862, a proper dinner, the kind planters hosted to show off their wealth and sophistication. Multiple courses, fine wines, expensive bourbon afterward. The soldiers accepted eagerly because they were tired from weeks of travel, bored from guard duty, young men who wanted good food and better company. They had no reason to suspect anything. Blackwood had been a gracious host, had provided everything they needed. had seemed the model of Confederate hospitality and cooperation. So they washed, put on clean uniforms, came to the dining room with appetites and good spirits. Elijah served the first course. Oyster soup, watched the soldiers eat and laugh and tell stories about battles they'd witnessed, about friends who died, about hopes for Confederate victory. Blackwood encouraged them, refilled their glasses, played the sympathetic host. But Elijah noticed something. The soldiers' bourbon came from a special decanter. One Blackwood had prepared earlier that afternoon. One Elijah had been ordered not to touch. He thought nothing of it at first, because masters had special bottles for special guests. That was normal. The dinner progressed through multiple courses. Roasted duck, sweet potatoes, fresh bread, pecan pie. The soldiers ate heartily. Their initial formality gave way to relaxation. They grew louder, more comfortable. One young soldier, couldn't have been more than 17, told a story about his younger brother back home, how the boy wanted to join the army, how their mother cried every night worrying about both sons. Everyone at the table nodded sympathetically. Even Blackwood seemed moved. Therefore, Elijah started to relax, started to think this was just what it appeared to be. A simple dinner, a gesture of Southern hospitality. He was wrong. The first soldier to react was a private named James Dockery, only 19 years old, from a small farm in Alabama. He was in the middle of a story when his voice suddenly cut off. His hand went to his throat. His eyes widened in confusion and terror. He tried to stand, knocked over his chair, stumbled. The other soldiers looked at him in confusion. Then another soldier convulsed. Then another. Within 60 seconds, all 7 men were in distress, clawing at their throats, gasping for air, collapsing, dying. Elijah stood frozen by the door. He'd seen violence before, had seen slaves beaten to death, had seen children sold away from mothers, had witnessed every casual cruelty of slavery. But this was different. This was calculated mass murder, because Blackwood wasn't acting in anger or passion. This was planned, deliberate, cold. The soldiers writhed on the floor. Some vomited blood. Some had seizures. One young soldier, the 17-year-old who'd been talking about his brother, reached toward Blackwood with a pleading expression, seeking help, seeking explanation. Blackwood stood over him, watched him die, showed no emotion whatsoever. When the last soldier stopped moving, Blackwood turned to Cyrus Webb, the head overseer who'd been standing guard at the door. "Get Thomas, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, and James. Tell them to bring shovels and chains. We have bodies to dispose of." Webb nodded and left. Then Blackwood looked directly at Elijah. "You saw nothing. You were never in this room tonight. If you speak one word of this to anyone, I'll have you flayed alive and your body fed to the hogs. Do you understand?" Elijah, terrified, nodded. "Yes, master, I understand." But understanding and obeying were different things. Because Elijah had just watched 7 men be murdered for no reason he could see. 7 soldiers who'd done nothing wrong except guard Confederate gold. 7 young men with families, with futures, with lives that mattered, poisoned by the man they trusted. So Elijah knew if Blackwood could kill 7 Confederate soldiers without hesitation, he'd kill 1 slave without thought. The only question was when. Over the next 6 hours, Elijah was forced to help move the bodies. 5 overseers arrived, men Blackwood trusted absolutely, men who'd proven their loyalty through years of brutalizing slaves. Thomas Riddle, Marcus Finch, Samuel Cross, Daniel Marsh, James Cutter. Plus, Webb made 6. Blackwood was paying them well. $5,000 each from the gold once it was safely hidden. Therefore, these men would stay silent, would help murder and dispose of witnesses, would become accomplices in crimes that should get them all hanged. The bodies were dragged through the plantation under cover of darkness, loaded into a wagon, driven deep into the swamp. The Yazoo swamps were vast, treacherous, filled with quicksand and alligators. A perfect place to hide evidence. They found a spot where the water was deep and dark, where the bottom dropped away to unknown depths. Chains were wrapped around the bodies, heavy chains that would keep them submerged. One by one, the 7 Confederate soldiers were rolled into the water. They sank immediately, disappeared into the black depths. Alligator eyes gleamed in lantern light. Nature would complete the disposal. But Blackwood kept 3 bodies back, Captain Brennan and 2 privates, because he needed insurance. If Confederate authorities came asking questions, he could produce these bodies, could claim the soldiers had deserted with the gold, could point to their corpses as proof they'd fought over the spoils and killed each other. The 3 bodies went into a cellar beneath an old hunting cabin on the far edge of Blackwood's property. A cellar few people knew existed. The bodies were arranged carefully, made to look like they died in a fight, guns placed in their stiffened hands. The scene staged perfectly. Then the gold was moved. All 20 crates hauled from the barn to the hidden cellar. Backbreaking work. Each crate weighed over 100 pounds. It took 4 men to carry one. They worked through the night. By dawn, the gold was hidden. The cabin was recamouflaged. All evidence was erased. The 6 men who'd helped were paid their shares, $5,000 each. They took the money and scattered, went to different parts of Mississippi. We're told never to speak of this, never to contact each other, never to give anyone reason to ask questions. Elijah wasn't paid. Elijah was threatened. Blackwood called him to the study the next morning, showed him a whip with metal barbs. You're smart, Elijah. Smarter than most slaves. That makes you useful, but also dangerous. He paused. So, I'm going to be clear. You know what happened. You know where the gold is. You know about the soldiers. If you ever speak of this, I'll make you wish you'd never been born. I'll hurt you in ways you can't imagine. Then I'll kill everyone you care about. Your mother Grace, your sister Ruth, every person you've ever spoken to. Do we understand each other? Elijah, keeping his eyes down, submitted. Yes, Master. We understand each other. But Elijah was already planning. Because he understood something Blackwood didn't. Being threatened means you're dangerous. And dangerous people find ways to survive. This is where the story gets dark. Where murder leads to more murder. Where Elijah's only chance at survival means dying first. If you want to see how one man rose from the grave to destroy 13 others, hit subscribe. Because what happens next will show you that sometimes the dead don't stay buried. Blackwood had a problem. 6 men knew the truth. The 6 overseers who'd helped move bodies and hide gold. They'd been paid well. They'd been threatened severely. But they were still liabilities. Still potential witnesses if anyone ever investigated seriously. So Blackwood needed permanent solutions. Over the next 2 weeks, they began dying in accidents. Thomas Riddle, crushed when a barn beam fell. Freak accident. Nothing suspicious. Marcus Finch, drowned while crossing the river despite being an excellent swimmer. Tragic. Unexplainable. Samuel Cross, trampled by horses that somehow got spooked in their pen. Bad luck. These things happen. Daniel Marsh died in a barn fire. Terrible. But barn fires were common. James Cutter, thrown from a wagon, broke his neck. Unfortunate. The wagons were dangerous. By mid-March, only 2 of the 6 remained alive. Peter Stillwell and Josiah Grant. Both men realized what was happening. Because the accidents were too convenient, too perfectly timed, too systematically eliminating everyone who knew about the gold. So they confronted Blackwood together, both armed, demanding safe passage off the plantation or they'd go to authorities with the truth. Blackwood seemed to agree, promised them safe passage and additional money. Asked them to come to the plantation office that evening to collect payment and receive travel papers. They came, still armed, still suspicious. But Blackwood had prepared an ambush. 4 guards with rifles waiting in the shadows. Stillwell and Grant were shot before they could react. Multiple shots, no chance. Their bodies were dumped in the swamp with the others. Elijah witnessed all of this, saw the systematic elimination of witnesses, understood that he was next. Therefore, he went to Solomon, told him everything, the gold, the murders, the certainty that Blackwood would eventually decide even one slave who knew the truth was too dangerous to allow to live. Solomon listened carefully, asked questions, thought deeply, finally spoke. There's a way to survive. Dangerous. Might not work. But it's the only chance you have. He explained his plan. A drug derived from roots found deep in the swamp. A mixture that would slow Elijah's heart to almost nothing. Would slow his breathing until it was imperceptible. Would create the appearance of death so convincing that even doctors would be fooled. Elijah would take this drug when Blackwood came for him. Would appear to die. Would be buried. And 3 days later, Solomon would dig him up with antidotes that would reverse the drug's effects, would bring him back from apparent death. Why 3 days? Elijah asked. Solomon smiled grimly. Because that's how long the drug lasts. Any sooner and you wake up in the coffin. Any later and the drug becomes permanent. 3 days exactly. That's the window. Elijah understood the risks. The timing had to be perfect. If Solomon was delayed, if something went wrong, if the drug was too strong or the antidote too weak, Elijah would die for real, would be buried alive and wake in the coffin, or would never wake at all. But what choice did he have? Blackwood was going to kill him anyway. So this plan at least offered a chance, a slim chance, but a chance. Solomon prepared the drug, a powder made from roots he wouldn't name, mixed with other substances, prayers spoken over it in languages Elijah didn't recognize. Hide this in your cheek, Solomon instructed. When Blackwood comes for you, when you know death is imminent, bite down on it, let it dissolve under your tongue. Your heart will slow, your breathing will stop, you'll feel yourself slipping away. Don't fight it. Let it take you. Trust that I'll bring you back. He also gave Elijah a small knife. If the drug fails, if you need to fight, this is your last option. Elijah's moment came on March 12th, 1862. Blackwood called him to the study, said he needed help moving something heavy, something important. Would Elijah come with him tonight? Of course Elijah would. He had no choice. He hid the powder packet in his cheek, concealed the knife in his boot, prepared himself mentally for what was coming. That night, they rode out to the hidden cabin. Blackwood said the gold needed to be moved again, said Union forces were getting too close, said they needed to relocate it to an even safer location. They began loading gold bars into a wagon. Exhausting work. Each bar weighed 30 pounds. After an hour, both men were sweating despite the cool March night. Blackwood offered Elijah water from a canteen. Elijah drank. The water tasted normal. But within 5 minutes, Elijah felt dizzy. His vision blurred, his legs weakened. Poison, the same poison Blackwood had used on the Confederate soldiers. Elijah's limbs grew heavy. He tried to reach for the knife in his boot, but his fingers wouldn't work. He collapsed. Blackwood stood over him. I'm sorry, Elijah. Truly. You're a smart boy, but you know too much. Can't risk it. You understand? As darkness closed in, as his body shut down from the poison, Elijah managed one final act. Bit down on the powder packet, they carried Elijah deep into the swamp, to a hidden camp where escaped slaves lived. A maroon community that had existed for decades, maybe 30 people. Families who'd run away, individuals who'd chosen freedom in the swamp over slavery on plantations. They survived by hunting, fishing, occasionally raiding plantations for supplies. Because the swamp protected them, its dangers kept slave catchers out. Its vastness hid them from searches. They welcomed Elijah, made space for him, shared food and medicine. Over the next week, Elijah recovered slowly. His body had been through trauma, the poison, the drug, 3 days of near death. He was emaciated, weak, but he was young, and he was strong. With food and rest, he regained his strength. More importantly, he planned. Because this wasn't just about killing Blackwood. This was about destroying everything he represented, about proving the powerful could be brought down, about showing that slaves weren't powerless victims. So Elijah made a list. In his mind, because he couldn't write it down. 13 names. 13 men who knew about the gold and murders. 13 men who'd helped or benefited or stayed silent. Blackwood himself. The 6 overseers, wait, no. 5 were already dead. 1 remained, Cyrus Webb, plus the 4 guards who'd ambushed Stillwell and Grant, plus 3 plantation managers who'd been complicit in covering up the murders. 13 men total. Therefore, Elijah's mission was clear. He would kill them all, one by one, systematically, and he would leave a message at each death. The dead rise. 3 words that would terrorize Blackwood more than any threat. 3 words that would make him understand that Elijah had come back, that death hadn't stopped him, that vengeance was inevitable. But Elijah needed help. He couldn't do this alone. So the men who'd rescued him from the grave became his allies in revenge. Marcus, Isaiah, Joshua, Caleb, plus others from the Maroon camp who had their own reasons to hate Blackwood. They formed a plan. Strike at night. Target isolated men. Make it look supernatural when possible. Leave the message every time. Create terror. Make Blackwood's men afraid of the dark. Make them question reality. Make them wonder if the dead really could rise. Because fear was a weapon. Maybe the only weapon enslaved people could wield effectively. The first target was Cyrus Webb, chief overseer, the man who'd helped poison the Confederate soldiers, who participated in every cruelty for 20 years. Webb lived in a small house on the plantation's edge. Lived alone because his wife had left him years ago, unable to tolerate his brutality. On the night of March 23rd, Webb came home from his rounds. drunk as usual, unlocked his door, lit a lamp, never saw Elijah waiting in the shadows, never had a chance to scream before a rope was around his neck. Elijah pulled tight, tighter, held it, watched Webb's face turn purple, watched his eyes bulge, watched life leave. When Webb was dead, Elijah positioned the body in a chair, left the lamp burning, and carved 3 words into the table. The dead rise. Webb's body was discovered at dawn when workers came for assignments. Panic spread immediately, because how had someone gotten into a locked house? How had they killed a strong man without any sign of struggle? And what did that message mean? Blackwood was informed, came to investigate personally, saw the body, saw the message, and felt fear for the first time in years, because he recognized the implication, but it was impossible. Elijah was dead, buried, gone. This had to be someone else, some other disgruntled slave seeking revenge. Nothing to do with him, nothing to do with the gold or the murders. Just coincidence. Had to be. He was wrong. Over the next 3 weeks, Blackwood's men kept dying. William French, the overseer who'd taken over Webb's position, shot through a window while eating dinner. No one saw the shooter. Samuel Porter, one of the guards who'd helped ambush Stillwell and Grant, found in his bed with throat cut. Message carved into the headboard. The dead rise. James Dutton, plantation manager who'd helped cover up the soldier's disappearance. Beaten to death with a shovel in the barn where he worked. Message left on the wall. Thomas Ridley, another guard, drowned in a water trough despite being an excellent swimmer. The message carved into a nearby post. Daniel Crawford, plantation overseer, poisoned with the same substance Blackwood had used on the soldiers. Poetic justice. Message left on a note pinned to his body. Marcus Fleming, guard captain, pushed from a barn loft, neck broken, message carved into the loft floor above his body. Each death was different. Each showed planning and patience, because Elijah wasn't just killing. He was sending a message, creating terror, making Blackwood understand that his crime had consequences. So Blackwood hired bounty hunters, professional slave catchers, men who specialized in tracking and killing. He offered huge rewards, promised $1,000 for whoever found the killer. The bounty hunters searched, found nothing. But then 2 of them disappeared. Their bodies discovered a week later in the swamp, partially eaten by alligators. With the message carved in nearby trees, the dead rise. The remaining bounty hunters quit, said the plantation was cursed, said there was something unnatural happening, said no amount of money was worth this. Therefore, Blackwood's workforce collapsed. Slaves refused to work, refused to stay in their quarters at night, started building barricades, started carrying improvised weapons. The ones who could fled to other plantations or into the swamp. The ones who couldn't huddle together and waited in terror, not knowing who would die next. The white community of Yazoo County was equally terrified. News spread of the killings, of the mysterious message, of the apparent inability to catch whoever was responsible. Some whispered about voodoo, about African magic, about slaves calling up spirits to take revenge. Others insisted there had to be a rational explanation, a gang of runaway slaves working together, maybe supported by Union agents, maybe part of a broader plot to destabilize Mississippi's plantation system. Confederate authorities sent investigators. They found nothing useful. Too many suspects, too little evidence, too much chaos. By mid-April, 11 of Blackwood's men were dead. The plantation had effectively ceased operations. Fields lay unplanted. Buildings fell into disrepair. Blackwood himself was a prisoner in his own house, had barricaded himself in his study, slept in short bursts with loaded guns on his desk. His health collapsed, lost 40 pounds, hair went completely white. Hands trembled constantly. Eyes were sunken and haunted. He knew, deep down, he knew it was Elijah. Because somehow, impossibly, Elijah had survived, had come back, was hunting him systematically. But Blackwood couldn't admit this. Couldn't acknowledge he'd failed to kill a slave. Couldn't confess to the murders that would explain why Elijah wanted revenge. So he suffered in silence. Waited for death he knew was coming. 11 men dead. 2 more to go. And then Blackwood himself. If you want to see how this ends, how justice finally came for a murderer who thought he was untouchable, hit subscribe. Because what happens next involves Union cavalry, hidden gold, and a public hanging that all of Yazoo County came to watch. April 20th, 1862. A unit of Union cavalry rode into Yazoo County, advanced scouts for the forces that would eventually siege Vicksburg. They were gathering intelligence about Confederate positions and supplies. looking for anything useful to the Union war effort, looking for loyal Unionists and slaves who could provide information. Their commander was Captain William Terrell, a career officer from Pennsylvania, tough and pragmatic. Elijah saw opportunity, because Union forces meant authority, meant someone who might actually investigate Blackwood's crimes, meant a chance at justice beyond personal revenge. So he emerged from hiding, approached the Union camp at night, told Captain Terrell he had information about Confederate gold, about murders, about crimes that needed answering for. Terrell was skeptical. He'd heard 100 wild stories since entering Mississippi. Slaves often exaggerated or invented information, hoping to gain favor or protection. But Elijah was specific, gave details, locations, names. Described the night 7 Confederate soldiers were poisoned, the locations where bodies were dumped in the swamp, the hidden cabin with a cellar where 3 bodies remained and 20 crates of gold were stored. Gave names of witnesses who'd been systematically murdered, explained Blackwood's motive, outlined the entire conspiracy. Therefore, Terrell decided to investigate. The next day, April 21st, Terrell and 20 soldiers rode to Blackwood Manor, demanded to search the property. Blackwood, desperate and terrified, initially refused. Claimed this was Confederate territory, claimed Union forces had no authority. But Terrell was in no mood for debate. "I have 20 armed men," he said flatly. "That's all the authority I need. Now you can cooperate and make this easy, or you can resist and make this hard. Your choice." Blackwood chose cooperation because he was outnumbered, outgunned, and too exhausted to fight. He sent word to his remaining guards to hide the gold, to move it quickly before the Yankees found it. But Elijah was guiding the Union soldiers, led them directly to the hidden cabin, to the cellar beneath. They arrived before Blackwood's men could move anything. Found the gold, all 20 crates, also found the 3 bodies Blackwood had kept as insurance. Captain Brennan and 2 privates, still in Confederate uniforms, still arranged in their staged scene, identifiable despite decomposition. Terrell examined everything, read the Confederate Army stamps on the crates, counted the gold bars, studied the bodies, understood immediately what had happened. Because this wasn't just theft. This was murder of Confederate soldiers, theft of Confederate treasury funds. Even by Confederate law, these were capital crimes. Even in the chaos of war, this was inexcusable. Terrell arrested Blackwood on the spot, also arrested the 3 remaining guards who'd been trying to move the gold. All were taken to the Union camp under heavy guard. Word of the gold discovery spread rapidly. Therefore, within days, federal authorities from Jackson arrived. A judge advocate came to determine proper legal proceedings. Technically, Blackwood should be tried by Confederate courts because these were Confederate soldiers and Confederate property. But the Confederacy didn't control this territory anymore. Union forces occupied Yazoo County. Union military law applied. The decision was made. Blackwood would be tried by Union Military Tribunal, charged with murder of 7 Confederate soldiers and theft of Confederate government property. If convicted, he would hang. Meanwhile, Elijah had 2 more targets, the last 2 men on his list who weren't in Union custody. Josiah Grant and Peter Stillwell, the 2 overseers who'd fled weeks earlier when they realized Blackwood was eliminating witnesses. Grant had made it to Confederate lines, was hiding in Vicksburg, thinking he was safe. Stillwell was in Jackson, working under a false name, trying to disappear. Elijah tracked them both, because the account had to be balanced. Every man who knew about the murders, every man who participated or profited or stayed silent. All of them had to pay. For Stillwell, Elijah traveled to Jackson, found him in a rooming house, working as a stable hand under the name James Cooper. Elijah waited, watched his routines, learned his patterns. Then one night when Stillwell was alone, when the other men in the rooming house were at a tavern, Elijah entered his room. Stillwell never had time to scream, never had time to understand what was happening, just felt hands around his throat, felt the life being choked out of him. His last vision was Elijah's face, the face of a dead man, the face of vengeance. When Stillwell was dead, Elijah carved the message one final time into the wall beside the bed. The dead rise. Then he left, returned to Union lines, disappeared back into the swamp. For Grant, Elijah had to be even more careful, because Vicksburg was deep in Confederate territory, heavily guarded, dangerous for any black person, enslaved or free. But Elijah entered the city disguised as a slave, belonging to Confederate officers, had forged papers, played the role perfectly, found Grant in a boarding house, living under his own name because he thought Vicksburg was safe, thought distance protected him. was wrong. Elijah found him drunk, scared, talking too much about gold and murders to anyone who'd listen. Waited until Grant was alone, until night had fallen and the city was quiet. Then entered his room. Grant never had time to scream either. Never had time to reach for the pistol under his pillow. Just felt hands around his throat. Felt death coming. His last vision, Elijah's face. When Grant was dead, Elijah carved the message one final time. The dead rise. 13 men dead, Blackwood and all his accomplices. The account balanced, justice served. Now all that remained was watching Blackwood hang. The trial was held on May 10th, 1862, in a commandeered courthouse in Yazoo City. The proceedings were swift but thorough. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The gold, 20 crates, clearly marked with Confederate Army stamps, over $2 million worth. The bodies, Captain Wesley Brennan and 2 privates, identified by their uniforms and personal effects despite decomposition. Testimony from Elijah about what he'd witnessed the night of the poisoning. About Blackwood's systematic elimination of witnesses. About the confession Blackwood had made before trying to poison him. Testimony from other slaves about the accidents that had killed witnesses. About Blackwood's behavior and statements. About the terror that had gripped the plantation. Physical evidence from the hidden cabin. From the swamp where other bodies had been dumped, divers had recovered 2 more bodies based on Elijah's directions. Because the case was irrefutable, the defense attorney, a Confederate sympathizer forced to represent Blackwood, could offer no effective counterargument. Tried to claim Blackwood had been protecting Confederate assets from Union seizure. Tried to argue the soldiers had been deserters who threatened him. Tried to paint him as a patriot, making hard decisions. But the facts destroyed every argument. 7 soldiers poisoned during dinner they'd been invited to. Bodies hidden in swamps and cellars. Witnesses systematically murdered. Gold stolen and hidden for personal use. This wasn't patriotism. This was murder and theft. The verdict came on May 12th. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. Blackwood and his 3 remaining guards would be executed together. The execution date was set for May 15th, 1862. 3 days away. Blackwood spent those final days in a cell, writing letters to his wife who'd fled to relatives in Alabama when the Union arrived. Writing justifications, claiming he'd acted to save Confederate resources, claiming the soldiers had been deserters, claiming everything was a misunderstanding. But no one believed him. No one cared. His time had run out. On the morning of May 15th, 1862, 4 gallows were constructed in the public square of Yazoo City. A crowd gathered, Union soldiers, freed slaves, local citizens. Everyone wanted to see the execution of Harrison Blackwood, the man who'd been so powerful, so feared, so certain of his superiority, now reduced to a condemned criminal in a Union noose. The 4 men were led out, hands bound, faces pale. Blackwood's 3 guards broke down, wept, begged for mercy. But Blackwood remained stoic, silent, perhaps in shock, perhaps simply accepting the inevitable. The nooses were placed, the sentences were read. Captain Terrell asked if any of the condemned had final words. The 3 guards said nothing. Blackwood spoke. His voice was steady, clear. I regret nothing. I acted to preserve Southern wealth from Northern aggression. I would do it again. The Confederacy will prevail. You Yankees will hang for your crimes against our nation. Brave words, defiant words, but hollow. Because everyone knew the Confederacy was losing. Everyone knew Blackwood had died not for the Southern cause, but for personal greed. The trap doors opened. The 4 men dropped. 3 died instantly. Clean breaks, quick deaths. But Blackwood's rope was slightly too long. He didn't die immediately. Strangled slowly, kicked and twisted for almost 2 minutes. Some said it was incompetence, poor measurement of rope length. Others said it was deliberate, that the Union hangman wanted Blackwood to suffer, that a quick death was too merciful for a man who'd murdered 7 soldiers and countless slaves. Either way, Blackwood died hard. His body was left hanging for an hour as warning, then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave in the Confederate section of Riverside Cemetery. Buried without ceremony, without marker, just a hole in the ground for a man the Confederacy wanted to forget. Elijah watched the hanging from the crowd, stood among freed slaves who didn't know he was the man who'd brought Blackwood down, who didn't know he'd risen from the grave to balance the account. He watched Blackwood struggle at the end of the rope, watched the life leave him slowly, painfully, and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not even relief. just emptiness. Because revenge didn't bring back the 7 soldiers, didn't undo the murders, didn't erase the evil that had been done. It just ended it. Stopped Blackwood from hurting anyone else. That was all. That had to be enough. After the execution, Captain Terrell approached Elijah. "The gold," Terrell said. "Legally, it's now property of the United States government. $2 million. Significant windfall." He paused. "But I've recommended to the Treasury Department that it be used differently. For reconstruction efforts in Yazoo County, specifically to help the freed slave population, to build schools and churches, to provide capital for businesses, to fund the transition from slavery to freedom." He looked at Elijah directly. "You risked everything to bring this to light. You died and came back to see justice done. So it seems right that the gold Blackwood stole and killed for should go toward helping your people. What do you think?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "I think the 7 soldiers would approve. I think making something good from something evil is the only real victory." Terrell smiled. "I thought you'd say that." Within a year, 3 schools for freed people were established in Yazoo County using the Confederate gold. A church was built. A bank was chartered that would provide loans to black farmers and businessmen. Processing facilities were constructed that let farmers sell crops directly to markets instead of through plantation owners. The gold that Blackwood had stolen and killed for became the foundation of a new economic system, one that gave former slaves real opportunity, real hope, real freedom beyond just legal emancipation. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't personal. It's taking what your enemy valued most, in this case, gold, and using it to build everything they tried to destroy. Elijah became a prominent figure in the freed community. He used his experience and intelligence to help others navigate the complex new world. He testified at multiple trials of Confederate officials accused of crimes against slaves. His testimony helped convict dozens of men who thought they'd never face justice. He helped establish some of the schools funded by the Confederate gold, taught reading and writing to adults who'd been denied education under slavery, became a minister, a community leader, a symbol of resistance and survival. In 1865, when the war ended and slavery was abolished throughout the nation, Elijah was 22 years old. He'd lived through the worst of slavery, had witnessed and experienced horrors, had died and been reborn, had taken terrible revenge. But he'd also helped build something new, had helped transform his community, had used his pain and anger constructively. Over the following decades, he continued this work. Married a woman named Sarah, had 5 children, lived to see them grow up free, lived to see his grandchildren attend universities, lived to see possibilities he'd never imagined as a slave. Elijah died in 1910 at age 67. By then, he was a respected elder, a man whose story was told and retold, the slave who came back from the dead, the man who brought down Colonel Blackwood, the hero who turned stolen gold into schools and churches. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, black and white, people whose lives he'd touched, people who owed their education, their businesses, their opportunities to the work he'd done. They buried him in Riverside Cemetery, not far from where he'd been buried the first time. But this time, there was no secret resurrection planned. This time, he rested peacefully. His work completed, his accounts settled. The legend that grew up around Elijah focused on the supernatural aspects, the death and resurrection, the ghostly revenge, the message, the dead rise that terrorized Blackwood's men. These stories spread throughout the South. Because freed people told them to their children and grandchildren, they became part of the folklore of resistance, part of the mythology of liberation. Some versions said Elijah was 7 feet tall, that he could appear and disappear like smoke, that bullets passed through him without harm, that he was immortal. Exaggerations, but exaggerations based on truth, based on the reality that Elijah had done something extraordinary, had challenged and defeated one of the most powerful men in Mississippi, had survived when everyone thought him dead, had brought justice when the legal system offered none. The white community of Yazoo County tried to suppress and distort the story. After Reconstruction ended and former Confederates regained political control, they rewrote local history, claimed Blackwood had been murdered by Union forces, claimed the gold story was Yankee propaganda, claimed the slave killings had been exaggerated or invented, claimed Blackwood had been a patriot and martyr. His lies were taught in schools, printed in newspapers, carved into monuments. Therefore, within a generation, most white families in Yazoo County believed the false narrative, believed their ancestors had been victims rather than perpetrators. the usual lies the communities tell themselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. But in the Black community, the real story remained. It was passed down carefully, was preserved as testimony. Because some stories are too important to let die. Today, if you visit Yazoo County, Mississippi, you won't find much physical evidence of these events. Blackwood Manor burned in 1863 when Confederate forces retreated ahead of Union occupation. The land was subdivided after the war, sold off piece by piece, eventually became farmland and later residential developments. The hunting cabin where the gold was hidden has long since rotted away. No traces remain. But Riverside Cemetery still exists. Elijah's original grave is there. The one he was buried in the first time. Empty now, but marked with a simple stone placed by his descendants in 1925. It gives his name, dates, and a single line. He rose that others might rise. A subtle reference to the resurrection story, a reminder of what he accomplished. Occasionally, visitors leave tokens at the grave, coins, flowers, small written prayers, acknowledgments of a man who refused to accept injustice even after death. Local historians have complicated relationships with this story. Some embrace it as important heritage, document it carefully, include it in historical tours. Others dismiss it as exaggerated legend, point out that details can't all be verified, note inconsistencies in various tellings, suggest the whole thing might be fabricated or dramatically enhanced for political purposes during Reconstruction, and they're not entirely wrong, because the story has certainly grown in the telling. Details have been added, supernatural elements have been emphasized. Some aspects are probably more legend than fact, but the core remains documented. Union military records confirmed the gold seizure at Blackwood Manor on April 21, 1862. Confirmed the discovery of 3 bodies identified as Confederate soldiers. Confirmed Blackwood's arrest and trial. Confirmed his execution on May 15, 1862. Confirmed testimony from a slave named Elijah about murders and theft. Confederate records, such as survived the war, confirmed that a shipment of Treasury gold went missing in early 1862. Confirmed that Captain Wesley Brennan and 6 soldiers were reported as deserters, later corrected to murdered when their bodies were found. Therefore, the documentary evidence supports the basic narrative, even if specific details remain disputed. The question that haunts historians: did Elijah really die and get resurrected by African medicine? Or was it an elaborate ruse that grew into legend? Some argue the drug story is metaphorical, that Elijah escaped somehow and the burial was staged, that the resurrection narrative was created later to give the story mythic power. Others point to well-documented historical examples of drugs from Africa and the Caribbean that could slow vital signs dramatically. Point to cases of apparent death followed by revival. Argue that Solomon could have possessed such knowledge. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Because whether Elijah literally died or appeared to die matters less than what the story represents. A man who refused to stay buried, who came back to demand justice, who proved that even death couldn't stop the pursuit of accountability. That's the power of the story. That's why it survived 160 years. Elijah's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and revenge. Was he right to kill 13 men? Some were directly guilty, participated in murders, helped hide bodies, profited from stolen gold. Others were complicit, knew what happened and stayed silent, benefited from the system that enabled the crimes. But all of them died by Elijah's hand or at his direction. Does that make him a hero? A murderer? Something more complex? The answer depends on your framework for understanding justice. In the legal framework of 1862, Elijah was a criminal. Slaves couldn't testify against whites in court, had no legal recourse for crimes committed against them. The system offered them no path to justice. Therefore, Elijah created his own path. In the moral framework, the question becomes more complex. He killed men who participated in or enabled murder. Men who'd have faced execution anyway if the legal system had worked properly. Men who represented a system built on violence and oppression. So was he executing justice that the law couldn't deliver? Or was he taking vengeance that exceeded his right? History doesn't give us easy answers, because real stories rarely do. What we can say is this: Elijah's actions had consequences beyond personal revenge. The exposure of Blackwood's crimes helped convict other Confederate officials. Elijah's testimony at trials throughout Reconstruction put dozens of men in prison who thought they'd never face justice. The Confederate gold, recovered because of Elijah's courage, funded schools and churches and businesses that gave thousands of freed people opportunities they'd never have had otherwise. 3 generations of black families in Yazoo County got educations because of those schools, started businesses because of that bank, built wealth that could be passed down because of that economic foundation. Therefore, Elijah's actions, however violent, created lasting positive change. That doesn't make the violence righteous, but it makes it consequential. The legend of Elijah's resurrection carries meaning beyond historical fact, because it represents something fundamental about the human spirit: the refusal to stay buried, the refusal to let injustice have the final word, the refusal to accept that power is permanent and resistance is futile. Every oppressed community tells stories like this. Stories about people who refused to accept their oppression, who found ways to fight back, who proved that even when you have nothing, you still have choice, because those stories matter. They remind us that resistance is always possible, that justice, however delayed, can come, that the powerful are not invincible. Elijah's story is part of a larger tradition of resistance narratives in Black American history. Stories about people like Nat Turner, who led a rebellion, Denmark Vesey, who planned an uprising, Harriet Tubman, who returned repeatedly to slave territory to free others. Stories about countless unnamed people who resisted in smaller ways, who ran away, who slowed their work, who broke tools, who learned to read despite it being illegal, who maintained their humanity in a system designed to destroy it. Therefore, Elijah's story isn't exceptional in isolation. It's exceptional as a documented example of something that happened thousands of times in ways we'll never know about. How many other slaves faked their deaths to escape? How many used knowledge of medicine and poison passed down from Africa? How many waited for the perfect moment to strike back at their oppressors? We'll never know, because most of those stories died with the people who lived them. But Elijah's survived, and in surviving, it carries the weight of all those lost stories, represents all those unnamed resistors, honors all those who fought back in ways history never recorded. The 3 words Elijah carved at each murder scene, the dead rise, carry multiple meanings. Literally, they announced his resurrection, his return from the grave. Symbolically, they declared that the oppressed will not stay buried, that attempts to silence them will fail, that history has a way of bringing forgotten injustices back to light. Prophetically, they promised that the system built on slavery would eventually fall, that the Confederacy defending it would die, that a new world would rise from the ashes of the old. All of those meanings proved true. Elijah rose from his grave. So did a nation reborn after civil war. So did a people emerging from slavery into freedom. So did justice, delayed but not denied. The gold that Blackwood stole and killed for ended up funding the very thing he'd have hated most: Black education, Black economic independence, Black success. That irony wasn't accidental, because Elijah and Captain Terrell understood something important. The best way to defeat an enemy isn't just to destroy them personally, it's to make their crimes serve the opposite purpose they intended. Blackwood wanted wealth to preserve his way of life. His theft became the foundation for dismantling that way of life. He wanted to eliminate witnesses. His attempt to do so created the witness who brought him down. He wanted to bury the truth. His crime became one of the most documented atrocities of the Civil War era. Everything he did to protect himself became the instrument of his destruction. Therefore, Elijah's victory wasn't just personal revenge, it was systemic justice. Sometimes the most powerful resistance is refusing to stay dead. Not literally, though in Elijah's case, perhaps literally, but metaphorically. Refusing to let injustice bury the truth. Refusing to let power erase accountability. Refusing to let death, literal or metaphorical, have the final word. Elijah was supposed to die in that cabin, was supposed to be buried and forgotten, was supposed to become another unnamed victim of slavery's casual brutality. Instead, he came back, and his return destroyed everything Blackwood had built. That's the lesson of this story. Not that revenge is righteous, not that violence is the answer, not that individuals should take justice into their own hands, but that some things refuse to stay buried. Truth refuses to stay buried. Eventually, someone digs it up. Eventually, it comes to light. Eventually, it demands to be heard. Justice refuses to stay buried. It might be delayed, denied, seemingly impossible, but it finds a way. Memory refuses to stay buried. We try to forget uncomfortable histories, try to rewrite painful pasts, try to bury stories that challenge our narratives, but they survive. passed down through families, preserved in communities, emerging when we least expect them. Elijah's story survived 160 years because people refused to let it die. Black families in Yazoo County told it to their children. Who told it to their children? Who told it to theirs? Historians eventually documented it. Writers preserved it. Now you're hearing it. So the story that was supposed to die with Elijah keeps rising, keeps reminding us that power is not permanent, that oppression will be resisted, that even the dead can demand justice. We don't know every detail of what happened in March 1862. Some specifics are lost. Some elements are probably embellished. The line between history and legend blurs. But the core truth remains. A man was buried. He came back. 13 men died. Justice was served. Whether that justice was righteous or excessive, whether the resurrection was literal or symbolic, whether every detail is accurate or mythologized, those questions matter less than what the story represents. It represents the refusal to accept injustice passively, the determination to hold the powerful accountable, the courage to risk everything for what you believe is right, the understanding that sometimes fighting back is the only way to survive with your humanity intact. Elijah rose from his grave to kill 13 men, but he also rose to build schools, to teach children, to help his community, to transform stolen gold into legitimate opportunity, to live 50 more years as a free man. His resurrection wasn't just about revenge, it was about rebirth, personal and communal. The death of one way of life, the birth of another, the end of slavery, the beginning of freedom, the burial of injustice, the rising of justice. So when you hear this story, don't just hear revenge. Hear resistance, hear resilience, hear the refusal to let death, literal or metaphorical, be the end. Because the dead don't always stay buried. Sometimes they rise. And when they do, they change everything. Elijah's story is one of the most remarkable tales of resistance in American history. A man who literally died, was buried, and came back to demand justice. Whether you believe every detail or see it as metaphor, the message is clear. Some injustices are too great to stay buried. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about resistance and justice, hit subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to know that even when everything seems lost, even when you're buried alive by circumstance, you can still rise. Leave a comment telling us, do you believe Elijah really died and was resurrected? Or was it an elaborate survival strategy that became legend? Does it matter which? Because sometimes the truth of a story isn't in its facts. It's in what it represents. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and remember, the dead rise, always have.